Hi there, it's Alexandra from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog. And, unusually for me, I'm about to dig up my dahlias. My video on Don't Dig Up Your Dahlias has been very popular, and I've had a lot of comments and questions over the years. So I thought it would be helpful to talk about what those questions are and give you some answers, and then go on to how to dig up your dahlias if that's what you decide you'd prefer to do. Now, the first thing to start with is undoubtedly the weather. The Middlesized Garden is in southeast England, in Kent, and that's roughly what would equate to a USDA hardiness zone of about 8 or 9. What that means is that we don't get snow very often. Sometimes we'll only get it 1 in 3 years. We also don't get as many frosts. So the soil doesn't stay cold for very long. And I think that's the key. Now, my dahlias have stayed in the soil even when there has been a harsh winter, and they've come out fine on the other side. But I would say that if you have frost and snow for long periods regularly, there's much more chance of the earth getting cold. So that is really the main thing to think about. The other thing to think about is how wet your soil is. Dahlias don't like sitting around in the wet and the cold, and I don't really blame them. And although we do have much more rain here in the winter than we do in the summer, it is still, I think, a relatively dry part of the world. If you want to leave your dahlias in the ground, cut off the vegetation and protect the dahlia with a pile of garden compost or well-rotted manure. In one of our many Twitter conversations about whether you leave your dahlias in the ground or not, dahlia growers, Withy Pit Dahlias, said that if you actually want blooms that you can exhibit or really prize blooms, you do have to dig them up every year. And certainly if you're thinking of selling flowers or you want to be a flower farmer, dahlias need to come up every year. And I can completely see that, because after all, we all have different reasons for growing dahlias. And so that's really something to bear in mind. Over 10 years, probably 9/10 of my dahlias have come through in most of the winters. So people have asked me, can I move dahlias in November? If the dahlia is going to be fine at one end of the border underneath a pile of mulch, or why don't I dig it up, move it to another side of the border and equally cover it with a pile of mulch? Surely that will be just as good. Well, I tried that last year and it didn't work. I don't know why. I dug up a con amore dahlia that had come through several winters, including a very cold one, in the border, covered with mulch. I moved it to another part of the same border and covered it with mulch, but it did not emerge in spring. So for whatever reason, I do not advise that you move your dahlias or plant dahlias in the autumn. Let's now go over to Stephen Edney, who is the award-winning head gardener of the Salutation Hotel in Sandwich in Kent, and whose gardens are open every day of the year. Stephen's family actually grow dahlias professionally, so he is a great expert.
So the dahlias will be lifted normally, I'd say, when the frost blackens the foliage, but actually these days that can be almost Christmas. So we'll wait until some point in late November, and then we'll lift the tubers, cut the foliage back. So we'll cut the foliage back first, actually, to just a couple of inches off the ground, fork up the tuber, being careful not to damage the tubers, and then we'll gently dry them. Now, people do say about tipping their dahlias upside down so that any liquid in the stems can drain out, and so it doesn't rot the tubers. Do you know, I've been growing dahlias for 25 years now, and my experience has been that people tend to leave them just tipped upside down and then just forget about them somewhere, come back to them in the spring, and all the new shoots that have formed are facing the wrong way when they go to turn the tuber the right way up to plant it. We actually only tip our dahlias upside down overnight, just to let any actual, real liquid, real water, just sort of come out of the stems. But in terms of the kind of juice in the stems, that'll naturally just dry out during the winter. Then we turn them right way up. You can store them in crates or boxes, as long as there's a decent airflow. We actually use our old spent multi-purpose compost from plants that have died. Obviously, if they've died from anything that's a bit nasty, then we wouldn't be using that compost, because you don't want to contaminate your tubers with anything. But you could use, over the years, we've used sand, we've used straw, we've used a whole myriad of things. Used to use peat back in the day, of course, but nobody likes peat anymore. It's a great, it's a great product. It's just a shame that it has such a high environmental cost. So I completely understand why people don't store in peat anymore. They need to be somewhere dry, and they need to be in the dark, and they want to be just frost free. So they could go under a bench in a greenhouse and be covered, a cold greenhouse, or they could go into a shed or a garage if you don't have a greenhouse, and they'll be completely dormant and quite happy there all winter until you remove them in the spring and kickstart them into growth.
The problem with leaving any plant in the ground for years on end is that it grows and it spreads and it gets a bit out of control and the centre dies, and in the end you will get something scrappy. I literally have dug up hundreds of small tubers from just one dahlia that I planted 8 years ago. So it has thrived being in the soil for 8 years, although I think perhaps some of these tubers could be a bit larger and that I might do better next year to pick out the healthiest and then replant them. I'd strongly advise using a fork rather than a spade. As you can see, I started off with a fork, all that went well, and I thought it might be quicker and easier with a spade. I stuck the spade in, I cut across some tubers and I broke the spade. So even if you leave your dahlias in the borders over winter, protected by mulch, there will come a point when you need to dig them up. But don't let that put you off growing dahlias. After all, many, many beautiful plants are grown as annuals. I think gardening and learning to garden is a journey, and you find out what works for you. And I know that generally what works for me is to leave my dahlias in the ground, certainly for 2 or 3 seasons. I think leaving these orange cushion dahlias in the ground for 8 years has been too long. If you found this helpful, please do hit like, because then I'll know you'd like more garden how-tos. And if you'd like tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden, do subscribe to the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.